The morning I woke up to find my garage padlocked by the HOA was the same morning I decided that Brenda Patterson and her crew of busybodies had finally crossed a line that would cost them dearly. I stood there in my driveway at 7 in the morning, coffee mug in hand, staring at the industrial lock hanging from my garage door handle, and I felt something inside me snap like a dry twig underfoot. My name is Keith Yates, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision of Naperville, Illinois, for 3 years without major incident. Sure, there had been minor warnings about my trash cans being visible from the street after pickup hours, and once they sent me a nastogram about my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall according to their guidelines. But I paid my dues, kept my property relatively neat, and generally tried to stay under their radar. That strategy had apparently failed spectacularly. The notice taped to my garage door explained everything in the kind of bureaucratic language that makes your blood pressure spike. According to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, specifically signed by President Brenda Patterson herself, I had violated quiet hours on no fewer than 7 occasions over the past month by using my gas-powered leaf blower before 9 in the morning on weekends. The penalty was immediate confiscation of the offending equipment until such time as I paid a fine of $500 and attended a mandatory community standards seminar. I tried the garage door opener. Nothing. They had somehow disabled it from the outside. I walked around to the side door of the garage and found it also padlocked. Through the window, I could see my leaf blower was gone, along with what looked like my chainsaw and hedge trimmer for good measure. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and dialed the HOA office number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Brenda's saccharine voice instructed me to leave a detailed message, and someone would return my call within 3 to 5 business days. "This is Keith Yates at 847 Maple Grove Circle," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You people have padlocked my garage and stolen my property. I want it returned immediately, or I'm calling the police." I hung up and immediately called the Naperville Police non-emergency line. The dispatcher listened patiently to my complaint before explaining that this was likely a civil matter between me and my HOA, and unless I had evidence of criminal breaking and entering, they couldn't intervene in contractual disputes. "They broke into my garage," I said. "Do you have evidence of forced entry? Broken locks, damaged doors?" I walked back around and examined everything carefully. No damage anywhere. These people had been professional about their theft, I had to give them that. "No," I admitted, "but they took my property without my permission." "Sir, when you signed your HOA agreement, you likely gave them certain rights regarding property violations. You'll need to review your contract and possibly consult with an attorney. This isn't a police matter unless you can prove criminal activity." I thanked her and hung up, feeling my frustration building. I pulled up my HOA agreement on my phone and started scrolling through the dense legal text. Sure enough, buried in Section 47, subsection 12, there was language about the HOA's right to secure or remove any equipment, machinery, or items that pose a continuing violation of community standards until such violations are remedied. My doorbell rang at 8:30. I opened it to find Brenda Patterson standing on my porch, wearing her usual uniform of a pastel cardigan and khaki pants, her blonde hair styled in that aggressive suburban mom cut that seemed to be standard issue for HOA board members. She held a clipboard like a shield. "Good morning, Keith," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I wanted to follow up on the notice we left regarding your violations." "You broke into my garage," I said flatly. We exercised our contractual right to secure equipment being used in violation of community standards, she corrected. We have documentation of 7 separate instances of you using gas-powered lawn equipment before 9 a.m. on weekend mornings. The quiet hours are clearly posted in the community guidelines you agreed to when you purchased your home. So you stole my property. Her smile tightened. We secured it. You can retrieve it once you've paid the fine and completed the mandatory seminar. I have some dates here that might work for you. When did you document these violations? I asked. She flipped through papers on her clipboard. Let me see. October 7th at 7:45 a.m., October 14th at 8:15 a.m., October 21st at 7:50 a.m., October 28th. I was out of town the last 2 weekends of October, I interrupted. I was at a conference in Denver. I couldn't have been using a leaf blower in my yard. Brenda's expression didn't change. According to our records, violations occurred at your property on those dates. Your records are wrong. I have hotel receipts, plane tickets, and about 50 witnesses who can confirm I was in Colorado. She made a note on her clipboard. You can present that evidence at your hearing. In the meantime, the fine stands and your equipment will remain secured. What hearing? The disciplinary hearing. It's scheduled for November 15th at 7 p.m. in the community center. You'll receive formal notice by mail. That's 2 weeks away. The timeline is specified in your agreement. Section 49, subsection 8. Good day, Keith. She turned and walked back down my driveway to her white Lexus SUV, which was parked at the curb. I watched her drive away and felt an idea beginning to form in my mind. It was petty, maybe even vindictive, but these people had declared war over a leaf blower. Fine. They wanted to play games with property maintenance and community standards. I could play too. The thing about Meadowbrook Estates was that it had been built around a central cul-de-sac called Heritage Circle, where the largest and most expensive homes were located. Brenda lived there, of course, as did 4 of the 7 HOA board members. The circle was the showpiece of the neighborhood, with its manicured lawns, decorative lamp posts, and seasonal flower displays that the HOA hired a professional landscaping company to maintain. What made Heritage Circle special from a practical standpoint was its position at the lowest point of the subdivision. The whole development had been built on a gentle slope, and every property on my street, Maple Grove Circle, sat about 15 feet higher in elevation. When it rained, water ran downhill. When leaves fell, wind patterns pushed them downhill. And when people used to clear their yards, everything naturally wanted to accumulate in Heritage Circle. I said used to because the HOA had implemented strict rules about yard waste. Every property owner was required to bag all leaves, grass clippings, and debris for pickup every Tuesday. The landscaping company that maintained common areas was responsible for clearing walkways and the entrance of the development. But individual property owners had to handle their own lots, and there were fines for letting organic debris accumulate. I had been diligent about this, using my now confiscated leaf blower every weekend to clear my large corner lot. My property had 6 mature oak trees and 3 maples, which meant an absurd volume of leaves every autumn. Without regular maintenance, it would become a brown, crunchy carpet within days. As I stood in my kitchen that morning, looking out at the leaves already starting to pile up around my deck, I made a decision. If the HOA wanted to take away my equipment and fine me for maintenance violations, then I simply wouldn't maintain anything at all. Let's see how they liked dealing with the natural consequences of their own petty tyranny. I called my office and told them I needed to work from home for a few days. I was a software engineer for a consulting firm, and my projects were all remote anyway, so this wasn't a problem. Then I settled in to watch what would happen. The first day, nothing much changed. A few more leaves fell, but my yard didn't look dramatically different. I did notice Brenda driving slowly past my house twice, which told me I was already on her radar. The second day was windier. I woke up to find a significant drift of leaves against my front porch and more scattered across the lawn. My next-door neighbor, Frank Morrison, a retired accountant who usually minded his own business, came over around 10 a.m. "Hey Keith, you okay?" he asked. "I noticed you haven't cleared your leaves yet." "HOA took my leaf blower," I said. "Along with everything else in my garage, said I was violating quiet hours." Frank's eyebrows shot up. "They took your equipment, padlocked my garage, and confiscated it all. Want to charge me $500 to get it back," he whistled low. "That's harsh. Look, you can borrow my rake if you need it. I know you've got a lot of ground to cover with those trees." "Thanks, Frank, but I think I'm going to let them sit for a while. I'm making a point." He looked uncertain. "You know they'll fine you for that too, right? The rules say we have to keep our properties clear of debris." "Let them fine me. I'll see them at the hearing." Frank shook his head and went back to his house. He meant well, but he didn't understand. This wasn't about the leaf blower anymore. This was about Brenda Patterson and her board of petty dictators thinking they could abuse their power without consequences. By day 3, my yard was looking noticeably rough. The wind had been steady, and leaves were everywhere. They covered my lawn, my walkway, my driveway, and were starting to drift into Frank's yard too. He came out that afternoon and raked the border between our properties, pushing leaves back onto my side with obvious reluctance. Day 4 brought rain. Heavy, sustained autumn rain that turned all those dry leaves into a sodden, matted mess. The piles against my porch were now compressed layers of decomposing foliage. Water pooled on top because the storm drains along my curb were starting to clog with leaves. And here's where the topography of Meadowbrook Estates became relevant. Water from my property and the 3 others on the high side of Maple Grove Circle all drained toward the same system of catch basins, which fed into a culvert that ran underground directly to Heritage Circle. Usually, this wasn't a problem because everyone kept their yards clear and the drains flowed freely. But with my property generating so much leaf debris and the drains clogging, water was starting to back up and find alternative routes downhill. I watched from my window as small rivers of water, carrying leaves and organic matter, ran down the street toward the lower section of the subdivision. It was like watching a very slow-motion mudslide. My doorbell rang that evening. I opened it to find a man in a polo shirt with a Meadowbrook Estates HOA patch on it, holding a tablet. "Keith Yates?" he asked. "That's me. I'm Derek with the compliance team. I need to document the violations at this property." He held up his tablet and started taking photos of my yard from the porch. "Document away," I said. "Sir, you're aware that this is a major violation of community standards. The accumulation of organic debris is a health hazard and creates drainage problems for the community." "Is it?" I asked innocently. I hadn't noticed, but then my leaf management equipment was seized by the HOA, so I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do about it. Derek looked up from his tablet. "You can use manual tools, rakes, bags, etc. Can I?" Because I had multiple pieces of equipment in my garage, and your organization padlocked it shut. "How do I know my rakes weren't seized too? I haven't been able to access my garage for 4 days." This seemed to stump him. He made some notes on his tablet. "I'll pass that along to Miss Patterson. In the meantime, you're being cited for debris accumulation, failure to maintain property standards, and creating a drainage hazard. That's 3 separate violations. Better add them to my tab." I said cheerfully. He looked at me like I was crazy and left. I watched him photograph 3 more angles of my property from the street before driving away in a white pickup truck with the HOA logo on the door. That night, I pulled up the community drainage maps on the county assessor's website. I wanted to understand exactly where everything flowed. As I suspected, there was a main culvert that collected water from my entire section of the subdivision and channeled it directly into the retention pond adjacent to Heritage Circle. That pond was supposed to handle overflow during heavy rains, but it was relatively small and depended on consistent maintenance to keep the drains clear. The rain continued for 3 more days. I worked from home, comfortable in my office, watching the situation develop. More leaves fell. The drainage on my street got worse. Water pooled at the curb, creating a leaf-choked pond that slowly overflowed and ran in sheets down the hill. My yard was now completely buried under a thick blanket of wet leaves, and the wind was distributing them generously to my immediate neighbors. Frank knocked on my door on day 7. He looked tired. "Keith, come on, man. Your leaves are blowing into everyone's yards. I've raked my property 3 times this week and it just keeps coming. Can't you at least rake them into piles?" "Frank, I genuinely can't get into my garage to access any equipment. The HOA has it locked, so buy a rake. They're like $15 at Home Depot. Why should I buy new equipment when the HOA stole my perfectly good equipment? That's letting them win. This isn't about winning. This is about being a considerate neighbor." I felt a pang of guilt at that. Frank really was a good neighbor, and he was suffering because of my protest. But I also knew that if I gave in now, Brenda would have won, and her abusive interpretation of HOA powers would continue unchecked. "I'm sorry, Frank," I said. "I really am. But this ends at the hearing on the 15th. Just a few more days." He shook his head and walked away without another word. The situation escalated on day 9 when the local news got involved. Someone, probably Brenda, had called Channel 7 to report a property maintenance disaster in their usually pristine subdivision. A news crew showed up on my street at 3 in the afternoon. The reporter was a young woman named Jessica Chen, who looked both amused and professional as she stood in front of my leaf-covered property, doing a stand-up. "Behind me is what neighbors are calling a natural disaster in the making," she said to the camera. "This Naperville home has become buried under fallen leaves, creating drainage problems and complaints from neighbors. We're here to find out why." She came to my door next. I had been expecting this. "Mr. Yates, I'm Jessica Chen with Channel 7 News. Can you tell us why you've let your property get into this condition?" I explained the whole situation on camera. The questionable quiet hours violations, including dates when I was provably out of state, the seizure of my equipment without warning, the $500 fine, the padlocked garage. Jessica's eyes widened as I laid it all out. "You have documentation of this?" she asked. I showed her photos of the padlocks, the notice, and my plane tickets from late October. She examined everything carefully. "This is interesting," she said. "Would you be willing to do an on-camera interview about this?" "Absolutely." We did a 15-minute interview on my porch. I was calm, factual, and focused on the overreach of HOA power rather than making it personal. Jessica seemed genuinely interested in the story, and she told me it would probably air that evening. After the news crew left, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Yates, this is Patricia Holloway. I'm an attorney specializing in HOA disputes here in DuPage County. I saw the news crew at your property and wanted to reach out." "That was fast," I said. "I live 3 blocks away in Willowbrook. I know Meadowbrook Estates and I know Brenda Patterson. Your case sounds like something I'd be very interested in taking on. We talked for half an hour. Patricia explained that HOAs had broad powers under Illinois law, but those powers weren't unlimited. The seizure of property without proper notice and due process was questionable. The assessment of fines for violations that occurred when I could prove I wasn't present was actionable. And the refusal to allow me access to my own garage might constitute an illegal lockout depending on how the HOA covenants were written. Here's what I suggest, Patricia said. Attend their hearing on the 15th. Let them make their case. Record everything if Illinois allows it, which it does since we're a two-party consent state and you can announce your recording. Don't get emotional. Then we file suit in circuit court for harassment, improper seizure, and violation of property rights. We also file a motion for immediate return of your equipment and access to your garage. How much is this going to cost me? I asked. My retainer is $2,000. But if we win, and I think we will, the HOA will be responsible for all legal fees. These cases rarely go to trial. Once we demonstrate they've acted outside their authority, they usually settle quickly. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Let's do it. We arranged to meet the next day to go over all my documentation. I felt energized for the first time since this nightmare began. I wasn't just some helpless homeowner being bullied by a power-hungry HOA president. I had options, and I was going to use them. The news story aired that night at 6. Jessica had done an excellent job presenting both sides. She interviewed me, showed B-roll of my leaf-covered property, and then cut to an interview with Brenda Patterson standing in front of the pristine Heritage Circle homes. Brenda looked polished and reasonable on camera. "We have rules in Meadowbrook Estates for a reason," she explained. They maintain property values and quality of life for all residents. Mr. Yates repeatedly violated quiet hours, and when that didn't stop, we took appropriate action as outlined in our community covenants. Now he's retaliating by deliberately letting his property become a hazard. But Mr. Yates claims he was out of town during some of these violations, Jessica pressed. He can present that evidence at his hearing, Brenda said smoothly. We have a fair process, but in the meantime, he's responsible for maintaining his property and he's chosen not to do so. He claims you've locked his garage and won't let him access his equipment. We've secured equipment that was being used illegally. He has access to manual tools and can purchase whatever he needs to maintain his property to community standards. Jessica turned back to the camera. The hearing is scheduled for November 15th. We'll follow up with this story to see how it's resolved. Jessica Chen, Channel 7 News. My phone started ringing immediately after the broadcast. The first call was from my sister in Schaumburg. "Keith, I just saw you on the news." "What's going on?" I explained everything again. She was appropriately outraged on my behalf and offered to come to the hearing as moral support. I told her I'd let her know. The second call was from a number with an 847 area code. "Mr. Yates, this is Richard Kendall. I'm a member of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. I wanted to reach out personally after seeing the news tonight." "Okay," I said cautiously. "Look, I want you to know that not everyone on the board agrees with how this situation has been handled. The padlocking of your garage specifically was Brenda's decision, and she didn't consult with the full board before doing it. Several of us are uncomfortable with how aggressive this has become. This was interesting. Division in the ranks. So what are you suggesting?" I asked. "I'm suggesting that we can probably resolve this without it going any further. If you're willing to clear your property and pay a reduced fine, say $50 instead of $500, I think I can convince the board to return your equipment and drop the other violations." "What about the violations from dates when I wasn't even in town?" "We can review the documentation. If there's been an error, we'll correct it." "And who documented these violations in the first place?" I asked. There was a pause. "That would have been Brenda. She does most of the compliance monitoring." So Brenda accused me of violations she knew I couldn't have committed, seized my property, and now that there's media attention, the board wants to make it go away quietly. "I understand you're upset, Mr. Yates. But continuing this fight isn't good for anyone. Your neighbors are complaining about your property. The drainage issues are affecting other homes. Let's just reset and move forward." "Tell you what, Richard, I'll see you at the hearing. We can discuss everything then." "The hearing is just a formality. We've already determined that violations occurred. I'm trying to offer you a way out of this." "I don't need a way out. I need my property returned, a full apology, and for Brenda Patterson to face consequences for abusing her authority. See you on the 15th. I hung up. My hands were shaking slightly, but I felt good. I was done being pushed around. The next morning, I met with Patricia Holloway at her office in downtown Naperville. She was a sharp woman in her 50s with gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made me glad she was on my side. We went through everything: my HOA contract, the notices I'd received, photos of the padlocks, my travel documentation, and the timeline of events. "This is good," she said. "Really good. They've made several serious mistakes. First, the covenant language about securing equipment says they can remove items that pose an immediate safety hazard or ongoing violation. But it also says they have to provide written notice and an opportunity to correct before seizure, except in emergency situations. Did they do that?" I showed her the progression of notices I'd received. There had been warnings about the quiet hours violations, increasingly stern in tone, but nothing that said they would seize my equipment if I didn't comply. "Perfect," Patricia said. "That's procedural violation number 1. Second, their own logs show violations on dates when you can prove you were in another state. That's either incompetence or fraud, and either way it undermines their entire case. Third, by padlocking your garage, they've prevented you from accessing not just the seized equipment but potentially other tools and items you need for property maintenance. That's an overreach that goes beyond their authority." "So what's our move?" I asked. "We attend the hearing. Let them present their case. You present yours. I'll be there as your legal representation. Then we file suit within 24 hours demanding immediate return of your property, removal of all fines, and damages for harassment and improper seizure. We'll also depose Brenda Patterson about how she documented violations while you were in Denver." "How do you think she'll explain that?" Patricia allowed herself a thin smile. "She won't be able to. My guess. She assumed you were home and filed reports without actually verifying. When you can prove you weren't there, her credibility collapses, and that makes everything else she's done questionable." I felt a deep satisfaction settling in. "What about the leaf situation? They're claiming I'm deliberately creating a hazard. Are you?" Patricia asked bluntly. "I'm declining to do maintenance work that I would normally do with equipment that they illegally seized," I said carefully. "That's a consequence of their actions, not retaliation. You offered to maintain your property if they returned your equipment. They refused. Natural accumulation of leaves isn't a violation. It's just nature. Now, if you were actively dumping debris on common areas or other people's properties, that would be different. But you're just not clearing what falls naturally on your lot. In the context of this dispute, that's defensible." "My neighbors hate me," I said. "Your neighbors will get over it. And honestly, Some of them might thank you for standing up to the HOA. These organizations often get drunk on power because no one challenges them. Someone needs to draw a line. We spent another hour going over strategy for the hearing. Patricia gave me a list of things to document: photos of my property, photos of the drainage situation, statements from neighbors about the situation, and anything else that might be relevant. Over the next few days, the situation continued to develop. The rain finally stopped, but the damage was done. My property was buried under what had to be 3 or 4 inches of compacted wet leaves. They covered everything: my lawn, my driveway, my walkway, my porch. It looked like a brown carpet had been laid over my entire lot. More importantly, the drainage problems had gotten significantly worse. The catch basin at the corner of my property was completely clogged. Water from the last rain was still pooled in the street, and I could see leaves and debris that had washed downhill starting to accumulate in Heritage Circle. I took a drive down there to assess the situation. What I saw made me whistle softly. The retention pond was full of leaves and organic matter. The pristine lawns around Heritage Circle had piles of wet leaves in their landscaping. The decorative lamp posts were surrounded by debris. It looked like a tornado had hit, except it was all brown and organic rather than structural damage. Brenda's house was at the center of the circle, a large colonial with white columns and professionally maintained gardens. Those gardens were currently hosting about 3 feet of leaf accumulation that had washed down from my section of the subdivision. I could see her through her front window, and even from the street her expression looked furious. I drove home feeling almost giddy. Petty, absolutely, but also deeply satisfying. The next day I got a visit from the landscaping company that handled common areas. 2 guys in a truck pulled up and started examining the drainage situation on my street. "This is bad," I heard one of them say to the other. "The whole system is clogged. It's going to take days to clear this." They knocked on my door. "Hey, we're with Greenscape. We handle maintenance for the HOA. Any chance we could clear your property? It'll help with the drainage issues we're having." "Sure," I said. "That'll be $3,000. The guy blinked. "What? You want me to let you work on my property to fix a problem the HOA created?" "That's a service. I'm charging for it. We can't pay individual homeowners. We have a contract with the HOA." "Then I guess you'll have to figure out another solution, but you're not working on my property without compensation." They left looking confused. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Brenda, and she sounded livid. "Keith, this is absurd. You're holding the entire subdivision hostage over a leaf blower." "No, Brenda, you're holding my property hostage over fabricated violations. I'm just dealing with the natural consequences of your decision. You're deliberately creating a drainage hazard. I could have you fined for that. Go ahead. Add it to my tab. I'll see you at the hearing." "This hearing is going to be very unpleasant for you, Keith. We have documentation of multiple violations. You're going to end up owing thousands in fines, and we'll put a lien on your property if you don't pay." "Looking forward to it," I said and hung up. That night, Channel 7 News ran a follow-up story. Jessica Chen had been monitoring the situation, and she now had footage of the drainage problems in Heritage Circle and interviews with affected homeowners. One of them was Richard Kendall, the board member who had tried to offer me a settlement. He looked uncomfortable on camera. "Obviously, this situation has gotten out of hand," he said. "We're working on resolving it, but Mr. Yates needs to be a team player here and do his part." Jessica also interviewed Frank Morrison, my next-door neighbor. "Look, I feel bad for Keith," Frank said. "I think the HOA overreached. But at the same time, his property is affecting everyone around him. I've spent hours clearing leaves that have blown from his yard into mine. It's frustrating. Fair enough. I couldn't blame Frank for being upset. The most interesting interview was with a woman named Dorothy Chen, who lived in Heritage Circle 2 doors down from Brenda. "I've lived here for 12 years, she said. Brenda Patterson has been HOA president for 8 of those years, and I've watched her become increasingly aggressive about enforcement. She's targeted multiple families for minor violations and driven some people to sell their homes just to get away from the harassment. What's happening with Mr. Yates is just the latest example. Someone needed to stand up to her. This was news to me. I knew Brenda was strict, but I hadn't realized there was a pattern of behavior. Patricia was going to be very interested in this." The hearing was scheduled for the evening of November 15th in the community center, a low brick building at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. I arrived at 6:45 with Patricia, carrying folders of documentation. The meeting room was set up like a small courtroom, with a table for the board at the front and chairs for attendees. About 30 people were there, most of them neighbors or curious residents. I saw Frank sitting near the back. Brenda sat at the center of the board table, flanked by Richard Kendall and 5 other board members. The meeting started promptly at 7. Brenda gavelled it to order and went through some standard HOA business first: approval of previous minutes, treasurer's report, and updates on various subdivision projects. Then she got to the main event. Item 7 on tonight's agenda is the disciplinary hearing for Keith Yates of 847 Maple Grove Circle regarding multiple violations of community standards. "Mr. Yates, would you please come forward?" I walked to the front with Patricia. Brenda's eyes narrowed when she saw the attorney. "Miss Holloway, this is a community hearing, not a legal proceeding. I'm not sure your presence is necessary. Mr. Yates has the right to legal representation at any hearing that could result in financial penalties or property actions," Patricia said smoothly. "I'm here to observe and advise my client. Unless you're suggesting he doesn't have that right." "Of course not," Brenda said tightly. "Please be seated." We sat in the 2 chairs facing the board. I set up my phone on the table to record, announcing clearly that I was doing so for my records. Brenda began by reading the list of violations. 7 instances of using gas-powered equipment during quiet hours, failure to maintain property standards regarding leaf accumulation, creating a drainage hazard, and failure to comply with previous warnings. Each violation carried a fine, and the total came to $2,300. "Additionally," Brenda said, "we're recommending that Mr. Yates be placed on probation for 1 year, during which time any further violations would result in immediate fines and potential legal action to place a lien on his property." "May I respond?" I asked. "In a moment. First, I want to present our evidence." She pulled up a slideshow on a screen. It showed photos of my property at various times, time-stamped and dated. October 7th, my leaf blower visible in the driveway at 7:45 a.m. October 14th, same thing at 8:15. The images continued through the dates she'd mentioned. As you can see, we have clear documentation of these violations occurring repeatedly despite warnings. Patricia leaned forward. "Miss Patterson, who took these photographs?" I did, as part of my compliance monitoring duties. "And you personally witnessed Mr. Yates using the equipment on these dates?" "I witnessed the equipment in use at his property, yes." "Did you personally see Mr. Yates operating it?" Brenda hesitated. "The equipment was running at his property during quiet hours. He's responsible for any activity at his property." I pulled out my folder. "I'd like to present some evidence of my own." I handed copies of my airline tickets, hotel receipts, and conference badge from Denver to each board member. "As you can see, I was in Colorado from October 20th through October 27th. I couldn't possibly have been operating a leaf blower in my yard on October 21st or October 26th, which are two of your alleged violation dates. The board members studied the documents. I could see Richard Kendall's jaw tighten. This was clearly news to him. Furthermore, I continued, I've reviewed the photos Miss Patterson took. The one from October 21st clearly shows my car in the driveway. But I didn't drive to the airport. I took a rideshare, and my car stayed parked on my street the entire time I was gone. So either someone else was operating equipment at my property without my permission, which would make me a victim rather than a violator, or these photos are misidentified. Brenda's face was reddening. The documentation is accurate. If you weren't operating the equipment, you're still responsible for ensuring no violations occur at your property. Who would be operating my equipment while I was out of town? I asked. Do you think I hired someone to violate quiet hours on my behalf? That doesn't make any sense. Patricia stood. I think what makes sense is that Miss Patterson saw or heard equipment running somewhere in the neighborhood on those dates and assumed it was at Mr. Yates's property without actually verifying. That's sloppy at best and fraudulent at worst. I resent that implication, Brenda snapped. Then explain how my client violated quiet hours from 1,500 miles away. The room was silent. Some of the other board members were whispering to each other. Richard Kendall finally spoke up. Brenda, did you actually verify these violations? Did you personally see Keith operating the equipment? I documented equipment running at his property during quiet hours, Brenda said stubbornly. That's not what I asked. Did you see Keith operating it? The property owner is responsible for all violations at their property. Answer the question, Richard said, his voice harder now. Brenda's hands gripped the edge of the table. I heard equipment running in that section of the subdivision on those dates and times. Mr. Yates has 6 oak trees and 3 maples. He's constantly blowing leaves. It was a reasonable assumption. An assumption isn't evidence, Patricia said. And based on that flawed assumption, you padlocked my client's garage, seized multiple pieces of his property, and assessed thousands of dollars in fines. That's actionable. The seizure was justified by the pattern of violations, Brenda insisted. I pulled out more documents. Let's talk about that. Your own covenant language says that you can only seize equipment after providing written notice and an opportunity to correct, except in emergencies. I've received warnings about quiet hours violations, but nothing that said my equipment would be seized if the violations continued. Where's that notice? More silence. Brenda flipped through her papers but couldn't produce anything. Furthermore, I continued, by padlocking my entire garage, you've prevented me from accessing not just the seized equipment but anything else I might need for property maintenance. That's why my yard is currently in the condition it's in. I can't maintain it because you've locked me out of my tools. You could buy new tools, one of the other board members said. Why should I spend my money to replace perfectly good equipment that was improperly seized? And even if I wanted to, I can't afford it because you're trying to fine me thousands of dollars. The board was looking increasingly uncomfortable. I could see the homeowners in the audience murmuring. This was not going the way Brenda had planned. Patricia stood again. Here's what's going to happen. My client is not paying any fines. You're going to remove the padlocks from his garage immediately, tonight, and return all seized equipment. You're going to expunge all violation records related to dates when he was provably out of town. And you're going to issue a formal apology for this overreach of authority. Absolutely not, Brenda said. This board has the authority to enforce community standards, and that's exactly what we're doing. Then we'll see you in circuit court, Patricia said calmly. We'll be filing suit tomorrow morning for harassment, improper seizure, violation of property rights, and damages. We'll also be requesting a full audit of your compliance enforcement over the past 3 years to establish a pattern of abuse. I've already spoken to several homeowners in this subdivision who have similar stories about Miss Patterson's overreach. This is going to get very expensive for your HOA. Richard Kendall stood up. I'd like to call for a 15-minute recess so the board can discuss this privately. Brenda looked like she wanted to object, but the other board members were already standing. They filed into a side room, leaving me, Patricia, and the audience members waiting. Frank came over to me. Keith, I had no idea about the Colorado thing. If you were out of town, then yeah, those violations are bogus. I tried to tell them that, I said. Brenda didn't want to hear it. She never wants to hear anything that contradicts her, said a voice behind me. I turned to see Dorothy Chen, the woman who had been interviewed on the news. I meant what I said on TV. Brenda has been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom for years. It's about time someone challenged her. Several other homeowners came over to express support. It turned out a lot of people in Meadowbrook Estates had grievances with Brenda, but had been afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation. The board came back after 20 minutes. Richard spoke first, and Brenda looked absolutely furious, which told me everything I needed to know about how that private discussion had gone. After careful review of the evidence presented tonight, Richard said, the board has decided to take the following actions. First, we're expunging all violation records for dates where Mr. Yates has provided proof he was not present at his property. Second, we're reducing the fines for the remaining violations to $250 total. Third, we're removing the padlocks from Mr. Yates's garage tonight and returning all seized equipment. And fourth, we're implementing a new policy requiring that all violation documentation include photographic evidence of the specific individual committing the violation, not just evidence of activity at a property. Brenda was staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. That's not sufficient, Patricia said. My client wants all fines dropped and a formal apology. Richard looked at the other board members. Another whispered consultation. All fines dropped, he said finally, but no apology. The HOA maintains that its actions were within its authority based on the information available at the time. Patricia looked at me. I nodded. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. I wanted this over with. Acceptable, Patricia said. The padlocks will be removed tonight, within the hour, Richard confirmed. Then we're done here. As we gathered our materials to leave, Brenda finally spoke, her voice tight with controlled rage. This isn't over, Mr. Yates. You've created significant problems for this community with your little protest. The damage to Heritage Circle's drainage system will cost thousands to repair. We'll be pursuing reimbursement for that. Try it, Patricia said mildly. The drainage problems were caused by your illegal seizure of his maintenance equipment. Any court would see that as a direct consequence of your actions. You'll lose, and you'll be responsible for all legal fees. I'd suggest you cut your losses and move on. We walked out of the community center into the cold November night. I felt like I'd been through a war, but I'd won. Patricia and I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, reviewing what had just happened. That went well, she said. Better than I expected, actually. The board split against Patterson once they realized how weak the evidence was. That's the best outcome you could hope for. What about the retaliation she threatened? I asked. Empty threat. They're not going to pursue drainage repairs through you. They know they'd lose. but I'd recommend documenting everything carefully for the next few months. If they do try anything else, we'll have a pattern of harassment we can take to court. Do I still owe you the retainer? Yes, but you got your money's worth. Send me a check whenever you can. And Keith, clean your yard. The point has been made, I laughed. First thing tomorrow. I drove home and found a work truck from the HOA's maintenance company parked at my curb. Two guys with bolt cutters were removing the padlocks from my garage. They handed me the keys without comment and left. I opened my garage and found everything exactly as I'd left it, except my leaf blower, chainsaw, and hedge trimmer were sitting neatly on the workbench with inspection tags attached. Everything was there and apparently undamaged. I didn't start clearing leaves that night. It was late and I was exhausted. But the next morning, I woke up early, filled up the leaf blower with gas, and got to work. It took me 3 full days to get my property back to normal. The leaves were so compacted that I had to use a rake in some areas before the blower was effective. I filled 47 lawn bags with leaves and organic debris, which I stacked neatly at my curb for pickup. Frank came over on the second day with a cooler of beer and helped me rake for a few hours. We didn't talk much, but it was his way of saying we were good. I appreciated it. By the time I was done, my property looked great again. The street drains were clear. Water flowed properly. And Heritage Circle, I noticed when I drove past, had been professionally cleaned up by the landscaping company, though the retention pond still looked pretty rough. A week later, I got a letter from the HOA. I opened it expecting trouble, but instead it was a notice that Brenda Patterson had resigned as HOA president effective immediately, citing personal reasons. Richard Kendall would be serving as interim president until the next election. Dorothy Chen called me that evening. "Did you hear about Brenda?" she asked. "Just got the notice. The board forced her out. After your hearing, several of us filed formal complaints about her enforcement tactics. Richard and the others realized they had a liability problem. Apparently, 3 other families were preparing to sue over various issues with Brenda's compliance monitoring." "Wow," I said. "So thank you. Seriously. You stood up to her when the rest of us were too scared. The subdivision is better off without her running things like a dictator." "I just wanted my leaf blower back," I said. Dorothy laughed. "Well, you got it, and you got rid of Brenda in the process. That's what I call a win." We talked for a few more minutes, and she mentioned that there was going to be a special election for HOA president in January. Several people were encouraging me to run. I declined immediately. I had zero interest in HOA politics. I just wanted to live in peace, maintain my property, and be left alone. The rest of November and December were blissfully quiet. No more violation notices. No more surprise visits from compliance officers. No drama at all. The new interim board seemed focused on actual community maintenance rather than petty enforcement. I did get a bill from the HOA in mid-December for my share of the repairs to the Heritage Circle drainage system. It was $300. I called Patricia. "They're trying to bill me for drainage repairs," I said. "What does the bill say specifically?" I read it to her. It was worded as a special assessment for emergency repairs to common area infrastructure, divided among all homeowners in the subdivision. "That's fine," Patricia said. "They're spreading the cost across everyone, not targeting you specifically. That's within their rights. Pay it." I did, though it annoyed me. Still, $300 was a lot less than the thousands they'd originally tried to extract from me. In January, the subdivision held its special election. A woman named Margaret Torrance, a retired teacher who had lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 15 years, ran unopposed and won easily. At her first board meeting, which I attended out of curiosity, she laid out a vision for a kinder, gentler HOA. Our job is to maintain property values and common areas, Margaret said. It's not to police our neighbors or make their lives difficult. We're going to focus on the big things and stop sweating the small stuff. If someone's grass is a few inches too long, we're going to let it go. If someone forgets to take their trash cans in for a day, that's not the end of the world. We'll address serious issues, but we're done with the petty enforcement that's characterized this board in recent years. The room applauded. I saw Dorothy Chen in the audience, beaming. As for Brenda, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband sold their house in February and moved to a different subdivision in Aurora. No one seemed sorry to see her go. My property stayed well maintained through the winter and into the spring. I used my leaf blower occasionally, always after 9 a.m. on weekends, and no one ever complained. Frank and I became better friends, grilling together on weekends and helping each other with yard projects. In April, I got a refund check from the HOA for $150. The cover letter explained that after a full audit of the previous year's finances, the board had discovered several questionable expenses authorized by the previous president. Some money had been recovered, and they were distributing refunds to all homeowners who had been assessed fines in the previous year. I deposited the check and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The system had worked, not quickly and not without a fight, but eventually justice had prevailed. Looking back on the whole saga, I don't regret any of it. Yes, it was stressful. Yes, my yard looked terrible for a couple of weeks. Yes, my neighbors were temporarily inconvenienced, but I stood up to an abuse of power and won. More importantly, I helped change the culture of the HOA for the better. Brenda Patterson's reign of petty tyranny was over, and Meadowbrook Estates was a more pleasant place to live because of it. The key lesson I learned was that HOAs only have the power that homeowners give them. Their authority comes from the covenants we all sign, but those covenants aren't unlimited. When an HOA oversteps, when it starts abusing its power for personal vendettas or petty enforcement, homeowners have recourse. It takes courage to fight back and it takes resources, but it's possible. I also learned that I wasn't alone. So many people in my subdivision had problems with how Brenda ran things, but everyone thought they were isolated cases. No one realized there was a pattern until I made my stand and others started speaking up. That solidarity made all the difference. These days, I maintain my property diligently. Not because I'm afraid of violations, but because I take pride in my home. I use my leaf blower responsibly. I keep my grass trimmed and my walkways clear. And I participate in HOA meetings to make sure the board stays focused on legitimate community concerns rather than petty harassment. Frank jokes that I should write a handbook for dealing with difficult HOAs. Maybe someday I will. For now, I'm just enjoying the peace and quiet of a well-managed subdivision where people are treated like responsible adults rather than subjects to be controlled. Every autumn when the leaves start falling and I fire up my leaf blower, I think about that November morning when I found my garage padlocked. I think about the decision I made to let nature take its course rather than submit to unjust authority. And I smile, because sometimes the best way to fight an oppressive system is simply to stop participating in it and let the consequences fall where they may. The leaves kept falling, just like they do every year. But now when I clear them, it's on my own terms with my own equipment at reasonable hours that respect my neighbors. And that's exactly how it should be. Meadowbrook Estates is a better place now. Margaret Torrance runs the HOA with common sense and compassion. Violations are handled with warning letters and dialogue rather than immediate fines and property seizures. The focus has shifted to genuine community improvement rather than enforcement for its own sake. I'm grateful for Patricia Holloway's legal expertise and guidance. She helped me understand my rights and gave me the confidence to stand firm against intimidation. The $2,000 retainer I paid her was the best money I ever spent. She's since helped 2 other families in the subdivision resolve disputes with the HOA, and her reputation as an HOA specialist has grown. As spring turned to summer, I planted new flowers in my garden and repaired some fence damage that had occurred during the winter. My property looked better than ever, and I took pride in that. Not because I was afraid of citations, but because it was my home and I wanted it to look nice. The community pool opened in June, and I saw Brenda there once with her grandchildren. We didn't speak. She looked through me as if I didn't exist, and I returned the favor. Some bridges, once burned, don't need to be rebuilt. Frank and I hosted a 4th of July barbecue and invited most of our street. 20 families showed up, including Margaret Torrance and several other HOA board members. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, set off fireworks that were technically a minor HOA violation but no one cared, and celebrated living in a community that had rediscovered its sense of perspective. Dorothy Chen pulled me aside at one point during the party. "You know what the best part about Brenda being gone is?" she asked. "What's that?" "People actually want to serve on the HOA board now. We had 8 people volunteer for the 3 open positions this year. Before, we couldn't get anyone to run because no one wanted to work with Brenda. She'd poisoned the whole system. Now we have residents who actually care about making the community better rather than enforcing rules for the sake of enforcement." That made me feel good. Real, lasting change had come from my stubborn refusal to accept injustice. As I write this now, almost a year after the leaf blower incident, life in Meadowbrook Estates is peaceful. My garage has never been padlocked again. My equipment sits safely on my workbench, ready to use whenever I need it. The subdivision looks beautiful, with well-maintained common areas and homes that reflect pride of ownership rather than fear of citations. I learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's inconvenient. I learned that rules without reason are tyranny. I learned that communities function better when they're built on mutual respect rather than authoritarian enforcement. And I learned that sometimes the best response to overreach is simply to stop complying and let natural consequences demonstrate the folly of unjust rules. My story spread beyond Meadowbrook Estates. Jessica Chen's news coverage was picked up by several national outlets, and I did phone interviews with 3 different news programs about HOA overreach. Patricia Holloway told me that she saw a significant increase in HOA-related cases after my story aired, as other homeowners realized they didn't have to simply accept abuse from their associations. Legislative changes are now being discussed in Springfield. Several state representatives have proposed reforms to Illinois HOA law that would provide better protection for homeowners and establish clearer limits on HOA enforcement powers. I've been asked to provide testimony if the bills reach committee hearings. I probably will. If my experience can help prevent others from dealing with similar abuses, that's worth the time and effort. The leaf blower itself has become something of a joke between Frank and me. It's just a standard Toro gas-powered blower, nothing fancy, but it's now famous in our neighborhood as the tool that brought down an HOA dictator. Frank sometimes calls it the Liberator. I've been offered money for it by people who want to own a piece of HOA resistance history. I'm not selling. It works perfectly, and I need it every autumn when my 9 trees deposit their annual payload of leaves. This past October, Exactly 1 year after the incident, I used my leaf blower on a Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. Technically still violating quiet hours, but I wanted to test whether the new HOA would say anything. No one did. Margaret Torrance drove past, waved cheerfully, and kept going. That's how it should be, common sense instead of rigid enforcement. I've thought a lot about what motivated Brenda Patterson to be so aggressive and controlling. I don't know her personal story, but I suspect it was about power and control in a life where she perhaps felt powerless in other areas. The HOA presidency gave her authority over her neighbors, and she wielded it like a weapon. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when petty people get small amounts of power. But I've also learned not to demonize her too much. She was following the rules as written, just without compassion or common sense. The real problem was the system that gave her too much authority without adequate checks and balances. The reforms Margaret implemented, requiring board consensus for major enforcement actions and establishing an appeals process for violations, have prevented anyone else from accumulating that kind of unilateral power. My property value has actually increased since the incident, according to my most recent assessment. Turns out that a well-managed HOA focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement is good for property values. Who knew? I still live at 847 Maple Grove Circle. I still have 6 oak trees and 3 maples that produce absurd amounts of leaves every fall. I still maintain my property diligently, with proper tools and equipment that no one has tried to seize since that November morning. And I still remember the lesson I learned. That injustice, even small injustice over something as minor as a leaf blower, deserves to be challenged. The cul-de-sac at Heritage Circle flows freely now. The drainage systems work properly because they're maintained regularly and everyone, including me, keeps their properties clear of debris. The retention pond is clean and attractive. The neighborhood looks great. And all of it happened because I refused to accept unreasonable treatment and let nature demonstrate the consequences of unjust enforcement. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just paid the $500 fine and attended the compliance seminar. I'd have my equipment back sooner, certainly. My yard wouldn't have looked terrible for those 2 weeks. My neighbors wouldn't have been inconvenienced. But Brenda Patterson would still be running the HOA like her personal kingdom, and other families would be suffering under her rigid enforcement regime. No, I made the right choice. It cost me time, money, and temporary neighborly goodwill, but it was worth it for the permanent positive change it brought to the community. As autumn approaches again, and I see the first leaves starting to fall, I look forward to firing up my leaf blower and clearing my property. Not because I have to, but because it's my home and I care about it. And that, ultimately, is what community should be built on. People taking responsibility because they care, not because they're afraid of citations and fines. The padlocks are gone. Brenda Patterson is gone. The culture of fear and petty enforcement is gone. What remains is a community of people treating each other with respect and common sense. And it all started with a seized leaf blower and one homeowner's decision to let nature take its course rather than submit to injustice. That's my story. It's not heroic or dramatic in any traditional sense. I didn't fight a war or cure a disease or save a life. I just stood up for myself when a petty tyrant tried to abuse her power, and I refused to back down when it would have been easier to comply. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed to create real, lasting change. The leaf blower sits in my garage, ready for autumn. The subdivision thrives under reasonable management. Life goes on better than before. And every time I use that blower, I remember that ordinary people standing up for reasonable treatment can make a real difference in their communities. That's the lesson of Meadowbrook Estates. That's the legacy of one man's refusal to accept unjust authority over something as simple as a leaf blower. And that's why I'd do it all over again if I had to, leaves and all.